This is Stephen Eckhart Musgrave, also known as Shogaku Zenshin Raoji, a title I don't use very much anymore. Anyway, I'm going to give a brief little description of the earliest part of the Zen tradition coming to the United States, along with its connection in particular to San Diego and San Diego State University. In 1893, there was a World Parliament of Religions held in Chicago, where they invited scholars and religious thinkers from all around the world to come and discuss their faith and mutual understanding. Among those who attended was a Rinzai Zen master by the name of Soyen Shaku Roshi. And he came with several attendants, and he traveled not only from Chicago but to several other places. One of the people that he brought with him was a monk who was born in Siberia, and his name was Senzaki, and his Buddhist name was Nyogen. Senzaki was kind of a semi-orphan. His mother was left in Siberia. His father was probably Russian or Chinese Russian. He was a scholar, and he was a very good Zen student, and that's why Soyen Shaku brought him with him to America. But Nyogen Senzaki was not happy with the atmosphere of Japanese Buddhism at the time. This is a time of extreme nationalism, which got even worse in the 1920s. And there were a lot of things that he disagreed with. At any rate, in a later trip that Soyen Shaku made, that he also had Nyogen Senzaki with him, when he was leaving back for Japan, he could notice the reticence on Nyogen Senzaki's part to go back to Japan. And so he told him that you do not need to go back with me. He was in San Francisco. You need to either conquer the city or let it conquer you. And you don't have any more obligation to me, just to your practice. So that's indeed what happened. And for many, many decades, Nyogen Senzaki taught Zen and worked various menial jobs in San Francisco. And he had what he called a floating zendo, which was going on in the 1920s, 1925, 26. Eventually, he took that floating zendo to Los Angeles. Now, before he left Japan, he was in charge of a kindergarten, a Japanese kindergarten. A lot of the monks had other roles in society besides being monks. And so he started the floating zendo there. And at the time, there was a Buddhist temple Soto Zen temple in Los Angeles. It still exists to this day. It's called Zen Shuji. It's in the middle of Little Tokyo. And when he was looking for work, he came across a woman named Mrs. Tanahashi who had a child who had Down syndrome and needed looking after. And she gave him a place to stay, and he looked after the child. And she was interested in Zen as well. And that led to another floating zendo, which he called Mentor Garden, after the kindergarten, only he was a mentor. That grew a little bit, and other people found it, among them Robert Aitken and G. Ray Jordan, who was a doctoral student at USC in philosophy and ended up being a teacher for many, many years, a professor for many years at San Diego State University. Ray, his father was a famous theologian and minister in North Carolina, one of the first people to to integrate blacks into his community. And Ray was a bit of a savant. He graduated from Duke at the age of 16, and I think Yale Divinity School something like 18 or 19, or something close to that. But at that time, he decided he didn't really want to follow exactly in the footsteps of his father and the evangelical, not necessarily evangelical, but the Southern Church. And he became enamored of and became a follower of Aldous Huxley, and followed Aldous Huxley around. Aldous Huxley was in Ojai for a while, where Krishnamurti was, and various and sundry other places. But during his travels, he decided he went to go back to school for his PhD at USC. And as part of that, he started studying with Nyogen Senzaki and became one of his students. Now, in 1958, Nyogen Senzaki passed away, but before he passed away, he became interested in a young poet in Japan by the name of Soen Nakagawa Roshi, who was considered a very, very influential young haiku poet. And they became friends and communicated with each other. They met once before the war. Then the Pacific War started, and Nyogen Senzaki was put into a concentration camp, relocation camp, if you will, at Hartz Mountain in Wyoming. After the war, they continued their conversation. In 1949, Nakagawa Soen Roshi, who was at that time the assistant abbot at the Ryutakuji in Mishima province, came over, and they discussed him reforming the center after Nyogen Senzaki died. And he did indeed die 9 years later. He was in his 80s in 1958. So at that point, Nyogen Senzaki was gone, and Soen Shaku had sort of taken over. And they had formed what they called the California Bosatsukai, or the Flower Sangha. And that then spread out to two places. Well, one went to Hawaii with Aiken Roshi. But G. Ray Jordan, Professor Jordan, had a sitting group in San Diego that sat at his house. One of the students was Charlotte Beck, and who became Charlotte Joko Beck, myself, and numerous others. Eventually, that went on for quite some time. Charlotte became involved with Taisan Maizumi and the Zen Center of Los Angeles. I was in many places at different times. I studied with several different teachers, Korean teachers, Zen teachers, etc., and went on to, collect Zen diplomas, as it were, Incas, etc. Now, the Zen group still was going on in San Diego. Eventually, that Zazen group eventually dissipated as Ray got older and he moved to Julian. And I kind of was left with maybe feeling like I should start it up again. So I started something called the Zen Institute of San Diego, which I did for 10 or 12 years. Unfortunately, then I came down with a rare form of cancer, which also affects your mental state severely, a carcinoid. And on top of that, there were some difficulties. I'm a traditional Buddhist in many ways. I don't necessarily... I do the chanting sometimes and that sort of thing, but it's more of a discipline. I look at the bodhisattvas and stuff in sort of a almost Jungian archetypal sense. But I do believe in the basic, as did everyone else that was in this lineage, with the possible exception of Charlotte Beck down the road. We believe in the basic metaphysics behind Buddhism, not scientific materialism. So anyway, we had printed way back in started in 1958. These little, I was 12 years old, so I wasn't part of this then. These little thin sutra books with teachings of Soin Shaku and some other things, which I have handed over some of them, and as soon as I find the rest, which are buried a little bit, I've given to the Dharma bums, who seem to be a nice group of people and very balanced. So that tradition goes on basically from way back in the 1900s, and it flows down, and there are also interconnections as well with most of the other groups. The Zen Center of, or the Catskills Mountain Center, and the one in New York City had also connections with that, as they came directly from Soyen Nakagawa Roshi and his student Edo Taimano Roshi, who passed away a couple of years ago, and who was a brilliant teacher, but also had extremely unethical and like many of the Zen teachers at the time, not all of them, but way too many, were involved with sex with their students and other things, which I consider reprehensible. And basically, I had complained about way back in the 90s and 2000s, and became persona non grata, and much of the Zen circles, particularly the tricycle crowd and all the rest of them that are over in the and that sort of thing. But at any rate, what happened then was, but that was a tradition that went on for a long time. So I hope in some ways that the Dharma bums just carry on the best parts of the tradition and not the mistakes, which I don't think they will. So that's a history, so it goes a long way. Also, at the same time, at Zen Shuji, the Zen temple, there were students after Nyogen Senzaki. He wanted a Zen teacher for Americans, and also one that wasn't as formal as the ones at Zen Shuji. And that involved bringing over, one of the people who came over was Yasutani Roshi, a rather interesting and more than a bit strange Zen teacher from Japan. And one of his disciples, and disciple also of Genpo Harada Roshi. And Maizumi, of course, founded it later on the Zen Center of Los Angeles, and all that group. So all those are tied together, and many of the traditions now either spring from that or sped from Suzuki Roshi, who had a similar situation in San Francisco, where he came originally to work for Temple, and then he branched off and just did, work with laymen, and founded the Zen Center of San Francisco and Tassajara, etc. So those little books and that little group, that's its history. It goes all the way back to Soin Shaku and Nyogen Senzaki and Soin Nakagawa Roshi. Now, I didn't have the pleasure to study under all of them, but I did with Soin Nakagawa Roshi, and we had a pretty strong relationship. He was just a bit eccentric character, and I could tell some really interesting stories about him. But this is basically a story just of the lineage. So that's my little story, and I hope all you Zen students are working hard and on your practice and doing well. And if there's anything I can do for any of you, answer any questions, and what little wisdom I have left, I'll be happy to do that. So, Sarva Manangalam.